Alexandra David-Neel was one of the first people to make the West aware of Tibetan Buddhism. She traveled to India and to China, ended up in Ladakh. At that time, travel was all by boat and train. Around 1924, Tibet was closed to outsiders. The British and the Russians had agreed to stay out. There was no foreign occupation, no interventions, especially no missionaries. Tibet abhorred foreigners and punished anybody who helped people sneak in. And they didn't send their monks out to learn about the world. At the time, the British Raj was in India. The British controlled the borders between India and Tibet. And yet, Alexandra David-Neel entered Lhasa in February of 1924. She bypassed all the controls. She did that by walking out from China for 3 months overland. In Lhasa, she spent 2 months, and then she traveled 3 weeks back to the British-Indian border in Sikkim. She was 55 years old. You can see in the photo that she was wearing blackface and had suited her hands to hide her white skin. She was disguised as a beggar pilgrim. She spoke Tibetan. Her companion, Lama Yongden, was a younger man. Occasionally he told fortunes to please the people they were meeting. They walked over high mountain passes up to 17,000 feet in deep snow, and so encountered robbers, starvation, illness. They ate what was given to them, including spoiled meat. They slept in the back of animal stalls or in a modest tent. Her kit, which was carried under her robes on her waist, included a gun, silver coins, and snow goggles. She was also carrying gold jewelry that had been given to her by the Prince of Sikkim. Who was this? Where did she start? She was a French-Belgian girl, indulged by her father. She started writing and publishing articles about Buddhism and Hinduism early on. She went to London and Paris, stayed at the Theosophical Society. She studied Sanskrit. She even gave lectures. She had met Annie Besant. For a brief period, she was an opera singer, and for a brief period, she was an underground activist and a maverick with a police record. At the age of 23, she made her first trip to India. Later on, she married Philip Neal. He was 39 and she was 36. They were late to marry. He was based in Tunis. They lived together for about 10 years, and then she traveled, being sent off by him, actually, eagerly. He sent money for the next 30 years, almost never seeing her. She went back to India, to Sikkim, at the age of 43. She studied Pali. She became close friends with the Prince of Sikkim. In fact, he took her trekking at high altitudes, and she became a very hardy trekker. She met the 13th Dalai Lama when she was 44. His message to her was, learn Tibetan. In 1913, she started to study Tibetan instead of Sanskrit. Sikkimese monks gave her a consecrated robe and put her in a long tradition of religious people who studied and copied manuscripts, and at great cost to themselves. She also learned Tummo breathing, which is a yogic technique on how to heat the body and survive cold. In fact, she spent 2 years in a cell in a cave, which she later described in a book. When she was in Calcutta briefly, she did become a friend of British Indiophiles like Charles Bell. She very much wanted to become the woman who snuck into forbidden Tibet, or the first white woman to enter Lhasa, and especially the expert on Tibetan Buddhism, especially Tantrism. At every juncture, she met monks and she got along with monks. They gave her manuscripts, she translated them, and she sent back everything to her husband, Philip Neel. And she advised him to maintain relationships with publishers because she intended to return and to spend the rest of her life writing. The minute she exited Tibet, she wanted to telegraph Paris and America. She won instant acclaim in Calcutta. Newspapers were filled with her stories. She was a sensation. There were many requests for her memoirs from publishers. An ally, Professor Sylvain Levi, encouraged her to arrive first in Paris in triumph. He was very interested in the 400 rare manuscripts that she had sent back. And in fact, those were saved from destruction by the Chinese later on. At the age of 60, she bought a home in the south of France. It was a year after she had published My Journey to Lhasa in 1927, which was fabulously successful. Her house was separate from her husband. He still lived separately. She was very interested in her public image and her reputation. She disdained James Hilton's book, Lost Horizon, that swept America, because Hilton had never traveled to Tibet. His tales of a phony Shangri-La were based on his imagination, but that imagination caught the imagination of the American public. She had many private letters burned, especially her correspondence with her husband and with the Prince of Sikkim. But her legacy was over 30 books on Tibetan Buddhism, written up to her last year at the age of 101. There are a few interesting facts about her life. One was her adopted son. Lama Yongden was a Tibetan, a novice monk at the age of 13. He passed his exams. Alexandra enlisted him as an assistant of sorts and also as of a kind of servant. But he became a translator, an interpreter, a researcher, and especially the fellow traveler out of China. He was popular and charming with groups. She adopted him as a son when they arrived in Europe with the permission of her husband. But in Europe, he faced racism. He faced mockery for being odd. He only spoke English and not French. Yongden wrote several novels that were published under her name and his. He died at the age of 56 of depressed alcohol. At the time, she was 87. So he was a companion of 40 years, whom she treated like a child and a servant much of the time. But she had no more significant books after his death. There's also the husband. Both were late to marry, and after 10 years, he sent her out to travel and sent money supporting her. He was said to be very proper, but fond of prostitutes. When she adopted saffron robes in India and told him about it, Philip was shocked that she was turning into a nun. But she reassured him and said it was a disguise. But she also threatened to retreat to a cave in Tibet. He tended to her shipments of precious writing and manuscript. He also tended to relationships with publishers. She was in touch with him on all her plans. And in fact, he rescued her from many dangerous situations where she was out in the wilderness and out of money, and her health was failing. In fact, she did not write much about India until after he died, although she had intended to come back and write about India at the time. When he died, she was 73, and they still lived separately. Much of this story is taken from the biography by Barbara Foster and Michael Foster that was published in 1998. Here you see also her famous book, My Journey to Lhasa. Outside Magazine called it one of the best adventure books of the last 100 years. You also see one of the example of one of her 30 books, Magic and Mystery in Tibet, where she described exotic practices that just amazed everybody. There's a very good YouTube video on her. It's in French with English subtitles. And then you'll see the review of that book, the Magic and Mystery book, in the New York Times, and her story, and how everyone loves to tell her story, including me.